Hello and welcome to another edition of ChinnyVision. This time we're doing a system review of the Acorn Electron. The Acorn Electron was announced in response to Sinclair bringing out the ZX Spectrum. Acorn had already produced the BBC Micro, and Acorn saw the ZX Spectrum was going to be a big threat to their market, especially with the Spectrum retailing at the low cost of £175. There was also, of course, a great deal of ill feeling between Sinclair and Acorn, with each of them wanting to outdo the other. So Acorn announced they were going to bring out a computer for between £120 and £150 that was going to have better graphics than the Sinclair Spectrum and also be compatible with the existing BBC Micro software base. The way Acorn planned to reduce the cost of producing the Electron over the BBC Micro was to take as many of the chips inside the BBC Micro as possible and integrate them down into one single piece of custom silicon, a ULA or uncommitted logic array. This was a very, very new thing at the time. Unfortunately, this was one of the most complex ULAs ever made in the UK, and there were massive problems producing it, which delayed the release of the Electron, which was intended to be out for Christmas '83. And as it stood, the Electron wasn't actually released until spring '84, missing Christmas and effectively consigning the Electron to the dustbin of history. So here's the machine itself. It's got a full contact keyboard, as you can hear there, no rubber keys. Doesn't have quite all the function keys and things that the BBC Micro had, but actually it's pretty much the same keyboard, and it's very, very solid. You've got the ports around the back, so let's have a look at the back of the machine. Just spin it around there. Bring it up to the camera. Nothing at the back there apart from a edge connector, which mine's got a protector on there, so I'm just going to whip that off there. And as you can see there, there's just a single edge connector on there that you could connect expansions on to that would give you parallel ports, serial ports, joystick ports, and all these other things that the Electron doesn't have. Also, if we look at the back here, if you can see that there, it's dated 82. Not a lot to see there on the bottom. Let's flip it over and you can see the side there. Let's put that down there. So look at the side here, left to right, you've got a UHF TV output, composite video, but that's mono only, black and white, RGB video, and then the cassette connector, and both of those are the same connectors as the BBC Micro has. I'm just going to flip her around. And there is the power input. No integrated power supply, unlike the BBC Micro. It's a simple barrel connector to connect up your power, except for one thing. That power supply there actually requires 18 volts AC. You heard me right, 18 volts AC, which is a little bit odd compared to the Spectrum, which requires 9 volts DC, and all the other computers you can think of pretty much that require DC. In fact, it's only the SNES that I can think of that requires AC. So the chances of getting a power supply that actually does the job are pretty remote. Even today, you go onto RS and start looking for 18 volt power supplies. Even they, with their hundreds of power supplies that they have on offer, don't supply one that will work with the Electron. However, because it's AC and there's a rectifier inside there to convert that into DC for the main board, you can actually put DC into it. And some people have actually reported, and I don't recommend you try this, putting 18 volts DC into it and the Electron working fine. Now, I wasn't happy with the idea of putting that into there because it was going to create a lot of excess heat because of the way AC needs to be turned into DC. And if you're just putting DC into there, you're going to cause problems. But if you take a 9 volt power supply, regulated, and put it into there, it works fine. The Electron's perfectly stable. There's no excess heat. It's 9 volts. Only one side of the rectifier will be working, but the Electron doesn't seem to mind that. And as I say, I've spoken to a few electronics people, and they say, yeah, it will be absolutely fine. And indeed, I've run this Electron for hours and hours, and it's fine just happily working on a 9 volt DC power supply. Doesn't matter about the polarity. So I've actually using my Spectrum power supply because I've got a regulated power supply for my Spectrum. Don't use the original Sinclair one, whatever you do, because that pumps out all sorts of nasties. But a 9-volt regulated power supply will work just fine with the Electron. Disclaimer, if your Electron blows up, we're not taking responsibility. Right, so what I think we should do is have a look inside this thing and see what makes it tick. So, legendary Acorn build quality. Feels just as well built as the BBC Micro does. It's very, very heavy. Sinclair Spectrum owners will be surprised at how heavy this thing actually is. Get those screws out there. Put that down there. Just 4 screws holding it all together. My arm in the way of the camera there. It'll be interesting to see how much Acorn have reduced the amount of components down to get it down to the price. It didn't meet the initial price they wanted. I think it came out for more than 200 when it came out. There's one screw there. Come on. That one's not quite undone. Also be interesting to see the size of this ULA. Apparently there were problems with them overheating and becoming... Come on. Still not quite there. Apparently there are problems with them overheating and needing to be reseated that were fixed in later models because they managed to epoxy them down. There we go. Right. So let's open her up. And there's some connector there. What's that? Keyboard connector there? Yeah, I have to be careful there. That's don't really want to start disconnecting the keyboard there if I can help it. But we can see well enough here what's going on. So over on the right hand side here, you can see actually there's a power supply board. There's a big old cap there, presumably to smooth the supply. We've got a rectifier in there as well to turn the power supply into DC. There's also a pass-through here that passes the 18 volts AC to the edge connector. And that's one thing I should have mentioned earlier. If you're planning on using expansions with this thing, then it's probably best to use an original 18 volt power supply, because if the expansion requires that AC, then you're going to have a few problems. I think, is that the pass through there? I think that must be. Yeah, it says 18 volts AC out and return. So your DC is going through there and your AC is going through there. That is the chip that all those different chips in the BBC Micro, the display, the sound and all sorts of other things has been integrated into. And here on the Electron, this is a later revision Electron, evidently, because it has the blob of epoxy resin on the top. The original models had a metal bar that seated the chip down that went across it. And what happened is the board heated up, the chip will get slightly pushed out of its sockets and the machine will become unreliable and crash. And Acorn fixed this by putting that blob on there to hold it down instead. One thing about the Electron is because everything is contained within that effectively custom chip, if that goes wrong, you're pretty much screwed. You can't go out and find another 6502 like the main processor or another RAM chip. The chip was made by Ferranti, and Amstrad were also sourcing chips from these guys for the CPC. But when Amstrad hit a problem with the manufacturing, what they did was go to another company and get them to make it instead, because Alan Sugar hit the roof that his machine was potentially going to miss the deadline. Acorn just soldier on, and that's why the machine was so late. They didn't go to different companies and say, hey guys, can you make this? And indeed Amstrad had 2 other companies on the case once their chips in the UK started to go wrong. So big mistake by Acorn there. The 6502 is there, of course, clocked at 2 megahertz like the original BBC Micro, but the memory running at 1 megahertz. So, as I say, anything running from RAM is going to have a problem. And the other thing to notice, there are a few electrolytic caps around. There's a couple of there, a couple on the power supply there, and that big one there that at some point you're going to need to replace. This machine seems to be working perfectly, but as we know, those caps dry out and can cause problems in future years. I've just flipped the machine around here as well because I forgot about this. The machine has a built-in speaker like the BBC Micro does. It's not as loud as the one in the BBC Micro, so at least it's not going to deafen you when you play games. And unlike the BBC Micro, there is no audio out on this, so you can't hook your monitor up to the audio out because nothing comes out. It's speaker only because this machine is so cost reduced. So we're going to have a look at some of the software that you can get on the Acorn Electron and some of the games that are worth looking at on the system. This isn't a definitive list by any means, or even the best games available for the system. It's just some of the ones that are interesting and worth looking at. And one of the first ones I want to look at is a game I've reviewed before. It's Boulder Dash, because we actually compare this to how this runs on the BBC Master. So it's a fairly decent conversion here on the Electron. But if we run the Master system on the right-hand side, not the Master system, the BBC Master rather, you can see it's a little bit faster. And one thing you won't notice on the video here is on a Master, the game feels far more responsive. The Elk feels a little bit sluggish to respond to key presses compared to the BBC Master. Of course, they both have the same processor, but the Acorn Electron has memory access at half the speed of a BBC Micro, which explains the problems. The game also has better sound on the BBC Micro. Also run Jet Set Willy on the Elk. It's a fairly decent port, not as colourful as the other versions. There's a few minor bugs in the game that unfortunately mean, like the original Spectrum version, you can't complete it. But it's actually a competent conversion here. Surprisingly, US Gold also did some conversions for the Acorn Electron, including Impossible Mission, which was a big hit, especially with Commodore 64 owners. Trying to squeeze this into just 32K, it's interesting to see how well it actually works. And actually, it does work well. Yes, the colours are incredibly garish. Nice animation on the player sprite. And the game is exactly as you expect Impossible Mission to be. You've got to access the computers, go through the lifts, and it is all here. It takes a little while when you leave the lift screen to get through to the other screens there. That was a bit quicker. Some of them actually, it sometimes takes a while when you go through. A little bit of a pause. And again, I guess that's just memory access time. Going into the 90s, Helter Skelter was a game that was ported to the Electron, and it's so tight on memory that all that mess at the bottom of the screen there is actually game code that's being put into the display memory to save space. Not really a game that's that well remembered, but it's interesting to see a late period Acorn Electron game. It's a little bit slow, doesn't play quite as well as the Spectre Amstrad versions, but it's interesting to see, I think this was 1990, possibly even later in fact, that the Elk was still getting brand new games. This was by Audiogenic. There's also things like the version of Commando that is already one for the BBC Micro, well, there's another version for the Electron as well, and the shortcomings of the BBC Micro version are doubled up in the Elk version. It's not really a fantastic gaming system. There's a few decent ports of existing games. If you think Repton's any good, then, well, you've got Repton. But for the rest of us, there's actually a very competent Boulder Dash clone that we've seen. The Electron, I guess, is actually a starter computer system when we come to look at it. A few people have said to me on Twitter that they got their Electrons and it was the computer that made them open their eyes to the world of computing. Well, yes, it was a cheap computer that enabled you to play games, do a bit of programming, run a bit of serious software. Today, why should you own one? Well, it's still an interesting system to own. There's not any games on here really that you're going to play for a long time. Of course, there is the elephant in the room, which is Elite, and it actually runs remarkably well on the Electron. As we can see here, Elite is as you'd expect on the BBC Micro. I think it actually runs at a fairly decent speed comparable to the BBC Micro. There doesn't appear to be much of a slowdown from memory here. There's a little bit of a complication because you don't have the function keys on the Electron. You have to hold caps lock down then access the function keys. And that took some working out when I first came to play this on the Electron, because I couldn't even launch from the space station until I worked out I had to hold down caps lock and then press, I think, F1. But this is Elite. It's really fast and smooth. We're moving around in space here. It's really a really good port of the game from the BBC Micro, especially considering the cut down nature of the game. I've been playing a lot of Elite Dangerous recently, so it's a bit odd coming back to the original. Oh, this is going to end badly. No, I'm gonna be dead. Yeah, I'm dead. Yeah. I've a bit of lost all my Elite skill there, having played Elite Dangerous a bit too much recently. There are a couple of gotchas in terms of owning an Acorn Electron. First of all, you can't run BBC Micro games. You have to have a specific Acorn Electron version. The second thing is tape loading. Now, Amstrad owners will know all about this, and I guess Commodore 64 owners and Atari owners as well, but not Spectrum owners. The Acorn Electron requires a remote socket on the tape recorder that you're using, so it can pause and start tapes by itself. Just like the Commodore 64 can, the Atari 8-bits can, and the Amstrad can if you've got a remote socket on your computer, although in fact on the Amstrad it's not essential. It's a pain, but you can get away without it. But the problem is with BBC games, and this doesn't just apply to the ELK, it applies to the BBC Micro, is quite often there's a pause during loading for it to display a loading screen. And then what happens is, of course, if you're playing that back from a tape without the remote pause facility, or you're playing it back from a PC, where you've got your tape lead plugged into a PC, the tape will continue playing while the machine was expecting it to pause, and then when it continues to load, suddenly the game won't be loading anymore because the tape won't be in the place the computer's expecting. But yeah, so if you want to own an Electron, they're fairly cheap to own. Mine was, well, I actually got mine in a bundle with a Master System. Neither had power supplies, and it was 15 quid for both of them together, so that was a real bargain. As I say, you can run this on a 9-volt DC supply, so don't panic if you don't have the original power supply with the computer. They're pretty sturdy, so you can take a punt on having one that is untested, but fairly cheap system to own. Don't be fooled by some people trying to sell them on eBay for massive amount of money. Bide your time. If there's one that's untested without a PSU, you should pick it up for very, very little, and hopefully it will work and be fine. If you want to be sure that it's going to work, then get one that's tested. You can play a lot of fairly common BBC Micro games on there, although they're not going to be as good as the BBC Micro versions. Games like Frack and other games apart from Elite, which we saw that runs quite well, run much slower. BBC Micros are quite pricey, so think of the Electron as a cheaper way to own a BBC Micro and have the BBC Micro experience. If you just want to play games, or unless you've got particular fondness for the BBC Micro or ELK, you're better off with something like a Spectrum Plus 2. But for people who played BBC Micros at school or have one at home, yeah, the Electron is definitely a machine that is worth looking at if you can get one for a decent price, which, as I say, is perfectly possible.